Welcome, everyone. I'm Rachel Fee. I'm Executive Director of the New York Housing Conference. We're a statewide affordable housing policy and advocacy organization. We are so excited to host this public forum for United for Housing, a campaign to develop housing recommendations for New York City's next mayor. While we're waiting for participants to join the call, I'd like to direct you to a link in the chat to a Menti word cloud. Click on the link and enter the code. Tell us, what does housing mean to you in one word? We'll check on results later in the program. When I think of housing, I think of safety, security, family, and health. What has been more important than housing during this global pandemic? Still in the grips of a health crisis, we are also facing a dire financial crisis in our city. We're looking towards the next mayor for leadership to steer us towards recovery with equitable solutions for housing investment in each of our 5 boroughs. Tonight, we have a wonderful program planned with the goal of getting your input, your ideas, and your housing advice for New York City's next mayor to be part of the United for Housing campaign. We look forward to hearing from you and incorporating your input into recommendations we're putting together to shape New York City's next housing plan. I mentioned we have a great program. We have kicking us off with some inspirational words, Wes Moore, the CEO of Robinhood, followed by Brendan Cheney, New York Housing Conference's Policy Director, Lydia Gabby, our event facilitator from HRNA, and we have a special message from our public advocate in New York City, Jumaane Williams. We'll then go into breakout discussions. For those of you who want to stay in the main room, we have a panel of experts discussing critical housing issues. I'm so pleased to be joined by Bernal Greer from Impact Brooklyn, Stephanie Becker from Cypress Hills, Matthew Dunbar from Habitat for Humanity New York City, Damaris Reyes from Goals, and Coalition from the Homeless's Giselle Roudier. I want to thank everyone for coming, thank our partners that helped with this event, and let's get started. So I'm going to share my screen. So bear with me one moment. So welcome again to United for Housing. We're so grateful to our sponsors or funding support from foundations like Robinhood and also Trinity Wall Street. And now we're going to hear from Wes Moore, the CEO of Robinhood, best-selling author, Army combat veteran, and social entrepreneur.
Hey everybody, this is Wes Moore, the CEO of Robinhood, and I am so excited to be here tonight with all of you with United for Housing on a very important and a special night. And I want to actually just leave a brief message for you. At this time and at this juncture, when we all know the impacts of COVID-19, it's important to remember what was going on when it came to housing before COVID-19. It's important to remember the fact that prior to COVID-19, 450,000 New York renters paid more than half their income in rent, leaving very little left over for emergency expenses, like the kind of emergency that we saw when COVID-19 entered our existence. Before COVID-19, on any given night, 60,000 New Yorkers slept in a shelter, including 22,000 of them, our most vulnerable, our children. Tens of thousands of low-income New York City renters have experienced COVID-19 related income loss. When you look at the people who have lost their jobs due to COVID-19, 23% of them were living in poverty before COVID-19, i.e., we're talking about the working poor. So why does all that matter? All that matters because your work yesterday, your work today, and your work tomorrow will not just make sure that people understand what's at stake, but also make sure that people should understand whose voices need to be heard. Your voice matters. Your stories matter. Your ability to lift up those who need and deserve a champion your ability to preach and speak and demand that people understand that housing is a human right, your ability to go out there and fight to know that the only way we are going to address these issues that are at our doorsteps right now is by making sure we are providing stable, safe, and supportive housing to all of our neighbors. So that's why I encourage you to share your story today at this virtual town hall. Share your stories tomorrow as you're talking to your neighbors and friends. Share your stories the next day as you're talking to elected officials. Share your stories every day. Let your story inform the decisions that our leaders should be making. Let your story sink in and burn into the minds of everyone who is running for mayor, who will be our next mayor, and other members of the city council. Let them understand why your advocacy matters and why you will not compromise on this. Housing is a human right. What advice would you give to those in office? What advice would you give to those in power? What type of city do you want to exist in? And what type of city do you want to embrace and love? We need you now as much as ever before. So we are incredibly thankful and grateful to partner with you. We are incredibly grateful to have United for Housing as one of our allies in this work and allies in this fight. But also, most importantly, we're grateful that now more than ever, you're making your voice heard. Thanks so much. Have a great event, a great town hall, and let's keep getting to work.
So that was Wes Moore. We are grateful to have him as a partner in this project. And now I'd like to introduce Brendan Cheney, New York Housing Conference Policy Director, to give you an overview of the United for Housing campaign.
Thank you, Rachel. After those inspiring words, I'm going to take just a few minutes to give you an overview of the United for Housing campaign. So over the past year, we came together with 80 organizations to develop housing recommendations for the 2021 mayoral campaign. We're going to take these recommendations and the recommendations you give us today to engage with the candidates and engage with the press during the campaign. And then once the new mayor is elected, we'll work with them to implement these recommendations. We started this work with 5 basic principles that we'll ask the candidates to endorse. 1, confront and undo a legacy of systemic racial discrimination in housing and homeownership. 2, prioritize preservation of public housing. 3, expand affordable housing supply through preservation and new construction. 4, improve housing affordability for the lowest income New Yorkers. And 5, reduce homelessness through coordinated housing and homeless policy. So we're focusing our recommendations in 5 key areas: public housing, new construction, preservation of existing housing, housing poverty and homelessness, and home ownership. And we grounded our work on data and our knowledge of the key housing issues in our city. And so what I'm going to do is show you some of those big picture issues that we saw when we were doing our work. So these are some of the housing issues and the housing crises that we see in our city. First, there were 1 million New Yorkers that were rent burdened before the onset of the pandemic. And since the pandemic, the data shows that there are 735 renter households in New York City that have someone who's lost income due to COVID. Both of these sets of households are at risk in this economy. They were at risk before and they're at risk now. We also have had an ongoing homelessness crisis that has been growing under every single mayor for the past 6 mayors. You can see in this chart that it grew under Koch, it grew under Dinkins, it grew under Giuliani, it grew under Bloomberg, and it grew under de Blasio, to the point where now we have 60,000 people a night in DHS shelters. And then NYCHA, New York City's public housing, which is one of our best resources for affordable housing, needs $40 billion for repairs, and it needs to improve its customer service, its management, and its operations. And then we also looked at the history of racial inequality and racial discrimination in the city. According to one study, New York City is the fourth most segregated city in the US. We have unequal homeownership rates that are rooted in a system of racism. 43% of white households are homeowners, but only 27% of Black households are homeowners. And homelessness affects Black households more. Black non-Hispanic households are 55% of city shelter population, but are, sorry, I've got something in the way, but are 24% of the New York City population overall. And so these issues of racial discrimination, inequality, and segregation are issues that we wanted to tackle. Now, good policy is made from the ground up. We're holding this event because we want to hear from you. Your input can help shape the policy and compel action from government, from the mayor, from the city council. And so we want to hear from you. What are your stories of housing need? What are your ideas for housing, zoning, and tax policy? And what's your housing advice for the mayoral candidates? Your input, your feedback will inform the report that we're working on to be released later this year. So there's 4 ways that you can participate. 1, share your thoughts in today's discussion in the breakout rooms or in the survey. 2, send a video message to New York City's next mayor. If you're interested in doing this, let us know in the chat and we'll reach out to you. 3, post your ideas or answer our survey. You can do this by going to our website, u4housing.thenyhc.org. And finally, you can speak up on social media, use the hashtag U4Housing, and follow us on social media at U4Housing.
Thank you so much, Brendan. And now we have some words from New York City's public advocate, Jumaane Williams.
Peace and blessings, everyone. My name is Jumaane Williams, and I'm the public advocate for New York City. I want to thank everyone for participating in United for Housing's conversation on affordable housing. I've always said that it's critical to do things with community, not to them. And conversations like this are critical. The COVID-19 pandemic has exposed and exacerbated the affordable housing and homelessness crisis our city faces, and one that will only get worse if we don't act quickly. Whoever the next mayor is will need to have a comprehensive plan for not just affordable, but income-targeted housing, because everything is affordable to someone. It's no secret how I feel about this administration's housing policies, which have often invited gentrification without meaningfully increasing the real affordability. Any way forward is going to have to recognize 3 things. 1, if we look the same way that we did 100 years ago, we wouldn't be New York City. 2, if we look the same in 100 years that we do today, we would have failed. New York City became what it is because of our transportation infrastructure and our ability to build up. But 3, we can't build our way out of this crisis, and we can't build at all without considering the consequences. We can, and we must, move forward honestly, responsibly, and in consultation with communities. That's why I'm so glad that this opportunity is here, to make your voices heard, share your ideas and your priorities. There's a lot we need to get done on housing in this city, from completely reimagining MIH, to requiring racial impact studies before any rezoning, to find ways to convert vacant spaces in truly affordable units, to investing in the 500,000 New Yorkers living in NYCHA right now, to expand rent relief, provide safe housing for homeless individuals, or keep tenants in their homes despite bad landlords. So please, share your stories, your struggles, because this isn't just policy, it's personal. It's not just about units. It's about you. Housing is a crisis. Housing is expensive. It's segregated. It's too often a political promise. But a home is safety. Home is security, sanctuary, a future. Home is a basic right. Let's help New Yorkers go home. Peace. Peace and blessings, everyone. My name is...
Well, that was really great to hear from Jumaane Williams, New York City's public advocate, who already has a lot of ideas how we can improve housing policy in New York. So it's a good spark for the discussions we're about to have. So now I'd like to introduce Lydia Gabby, who is our event facilitator, and she is going to lead you through what the rest of this program looks like. Oh, Lydia, you have to unmute.
Oh, sorry about that. Thank you, Rachel. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Very happy to see all of you tonight. Again, to sort of repeat a little bit of what we've said so far, we're going to be going into a two-part event where we've got breakout rooms. And for those of you who don't want to join the breakout rooms, you can return to this main session at any time and participate in this option 2 of participating in our critical housing issues panel. We've got a great lineup of speakers tonight talking about really critical issues that are important to all of us. The breakout rooms will be, just looking at someone in the chat, the breakout rooms will consist of a discussion of those same critical housing issues, and I'll get into that in just a moment.
Oh, sorry.
So thank you, Rachel.
Yeah.
So what's going to be happening in the breakout room is a small group discussion of major issues with housing and housing policy in New York City today, including housing affordability and access, discussions of homelessness, public housing, and many other issues that are of critical interest to all of us today. So in the breakout rooms, we sort of ask for a video-based discussion. So for those of you who registered in the Eventbrite to join a breakout room, we'll go ahead and put you into the breakout room. If we miss you, or if you would like to sign up for a breakout room right now, you can sort of send us a note in the chat or raise your hand on the Zoom platform to let us know, and we'll help you to join a breakout room. And just some general ground rules are the ideas for this to be an interactive discussion, talking about these issues with other New Yorkers today. And so the general idea is that we should all try our best to be present, turning our videos on so we can have a sense of togetherness and talking about the issues that we all face in New York City. Being active participants, so for each of us participating in those rooms, feeling free to sort of share the screen and talk about what we're writing together, take notes for yourself and others, making sure to write down everything that's spoken, and being present as much as possible, and helping to make sure that everyone has a chance to participate in the discussion. Next slide. So a couple of you have registered to act as discussion leaders. So thank you for signing up for that little additional responsibility. And what you would be doing as a discussion leader would be simply to help by keeping time. We've got clear instructions about the exercise in the breakout room, about sort of how that activity will continue, and discussion leaders will be helping us to keep that activity moving along, helping to make sure that we've got someone sort of taking notes and or sharing the screen, and asking questions to keep the discussion going. And if you sort of would like to leave the breakout room at any time, at the bottom of your screen is an option for you to click a button to leave the breakout room. I'll paste a link in the chat now to a shared Google Doc that when we go into the breakout rooms, everyone will have access to this Google Doc, and small groups will be discussing the content that you would be filling in.
Oh, that's okay. So thank you, Lydia. So you're going to make the magic happen and people will disappear into breakout groups. I see we have a couple of hands raised. So there'll be somebody on your team to reply to them if they want to enter a breakout room. And for everyone staying in the main room, we are going to begin our panel discussion. So I just ask all of our panel speakers to make sure that you have your camera on. And for our speakers, you can also unmute yourself. So Damaris, Burnell, Stephanie, Matt, I'm adding you to our panel, and Giselle. So Burnell Greer from Impact Brooklyn, thank you so much for agreeing to moderate this discussion in the main room. And again, if you want to join a breakout, just make it known in the chat and we'll redirect you to one of the breakout discussions.
Thank you so much, Rachel, for this opportunity. And hello, everyone. My name is Burnell Greer. I'm Executive Director of Impact Brooklyn. I oversee a nonprofit community development organization that serves the borough of Brooklyn. We own and operate affordable housing and help families in Brooklyn with a range of housing and community development services. On today's panel, we're going to talk about key housing issues facing New York City, and we are looking for public input into solutions to these problems. You've heard this over and over again tonight, and it's time to be civically engaged. You need to vote, you need to complete the census, and you need to participate tonight. Thank you all for all of you who have joined today's meeting to share your story, offer input, and give housing advice to the New York City's next mayor. We are in the serious grips of the COVID pandemic in New York. While we are still facing major health threats, we are also facing tragic economic crisis with so many people out of work, struggling to pay rent, and risk of eviction. It's going to be a long road to recovery for our city. As we discuss homelessness continues to grow, hundreds of thousands of people have trouble affording rent. Public housing needs tens of billions of dollars to make repairs. Racial inequalities persist, and too many are denied the wealth building opportunity of home ownership. We have an opportunity to transform housing policy in New York City. Now is the moment to come together and develop an ambitious plan to make the city affordable to all. We want to hear your story about what would be included in that plan and your advice for New York City's next mayor. But first, we're going to talk about the challenges. So joining me today is our Stephanie Becker, the Director of Community Development at Cypress Hills LDC, Matthew Dunbar, Vice President of External Affairs at Habitat for Humanity's New York City, Damaris Reyes, Executive Director of Good Old Lower East Side, better known as GOALS, and Giselle Routier, Policy Director at Coalition for the Homeless. We are delighted to be joined by these experts who have long been working on the ground on key housing issues and thinking about transformative solutions for system change. Today, we are going to talk about key issues facing renters, public housing residents, owning a home and homeowners, and homelessness. So Stephanie, let's start with you. We know that families were having trouble affording housing before COVID hit. Can you tell us how have renters been impacted by COVID crisis and why it is important for families to share their stories of housing need in the mayoral campaign?
Sure. Thanks, Burnell. This is Stephanie. I'm Stephanie Becker. So I just want to make sure everyone can hear me. Stephanie Becker from Cypress Hills, and we work similar to Burnell. We work across programs in East New York, Brooklyn, and Cypress Hills, and my team focuses primarily on affordable housing development. So we preserve and we build affordable housing. So as many people have said today, across New York City, there was a huge housing affordability crisis prior to COVID. In East New York, we really struggled. As many people mentioned too, across New York City, over 500,000 people were rent burdened before COVID. And in East New York, 41% of low-income households were severely rent burdened, which means they paid more than 50% of their income toward rent. Since COVID hit, things have only gotten worse. Many people are really struggling. In East New York, for example, there were a lot of people who got sick with COVID. Many people lost their jobs, and food insecurity and food access has only gotten worse. The food pantry lines in our community just keep getting longer. We've been able to provide support to the food pantries, but it's not enough. People are really struggling. Many families are doubled up and living in units they weren't living in before, like basement apartments. Luckily, though, the tenants who are living in our affordable housing are faring much better. If you have an affordable place to live, you're more likely to be able to afford other things like food and medicine and other necessities that you need. If you don't, you're struggling and it's much harder. We have a lot of people that we've spoken to in our community that are really having a hard time staying in their home, affording being able to live there, and many of them are at risk of being homeless.
Thank you so much for that. Giselle, wanting to reach out to you, how big is the homelessness crisis in New York City, and why does the next mayor need to make it more of a priority?
Yeah, so thank you so much for the question. I want to thank New York Housing Conference for having me. You know, it's important to acknowledge that we were facing a homelessness crisis in New York City even before the pandemic hit. You know, right now there are more than 58,000 people living in DHS shelters, and thousands more are sheltering in systems run by HRA and DYCD, and even thousands more are on the streets. So it's important to acknowledge that homelessness impacts all kinds of households, and the trends have differed recently for families and for single adults. Particularly for families, the impact on children is very devastating. So some sort of statistics that can help illustrate that are that for the past 2 years, each year, about 1,300 babies were born to mothers in the shelter system. So it's an extraordinary number of children who are starting their lives out homeless. At the same time, over the past school year, we had about 115,000 students in DOE schools who were categorized as homeless. That includes kids who were living in the shelter system, but also kids that are doubled up. And for single adults, and one other thing I'll say about kids also is that right now during the pandemic, we're facing really critical lack of access to strong internet signals, Wi-Fi, ability to connect to remote learning. And so we're really concerned about the impact in the long term that that's going to have on homeless kids. But for single adults, the situation is also extraordinarily dire. The number of homeless single adults has been rising pretty much unabated since 2008. We hit new records on an almost weekly basis. Right now, there are more than 19,500 homeless single adults just in the DHS shelter system, and that doesn't include the individuals on the streets. That's the highest it's ever been, and just for some context, that's about twice the amount of homeless single adults that were in shelters in the late 1980s. The last time things really peaked among homelessness for single adults. So to summarize, we need our elected officials to acknowledge the scale of the crisis and implement solutions that are going to meet that scale and address the issue for all types of folks that are experiencing homelessness.
Giselle, again, thank you for that. I read an interesting stat earlier this week, and it was again around COVID. And as you talk about children, the fact that many have lost their parent or guardian to COVID. And what's going to be the long-term implication for that if the breadwinner in the household is no longer there? And also, how does that equate to housing stability? So again, things that we need to keep watch over. I just want to make note that if you're interested in asking questions of the panel, to please put it in the chat, and Rachel will review those and be able to address those as they come through. So while there has been so much instability for many New Yorkers paying rent over the last 6 months, public housing in New York City has provided protection from income fluctuations. If you lost your job and live in New York City in NYCHA housing, you're not at risk of eviction as you would be in the private market. It really underscores the importance of protecting the city's public housing, which is home to more than 400,000 New Yorkers. I actually grew up in public housing up in the in the Rangel houses some years ago. Damaris, what can you tell us about the challenges facing NYCHA residents? Damaris, you might have to unmute.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for having me. I'm with Good Old Lower East Side, and we are a neighborhood-based organization that works on housing, land use, and other issues. And I personally live in public housing. I still live in public housing, so I see firsthand how important it is and the issues that we're facing. So the first thing I want to say is that nearly 8% of our rental units are public housing, which, represents a significant population and should give folks an understanding of how vital public housing is to the city. One of the biggest challenges that we're facing is a lack of funding to the tune of about $40 billion is what NYCHA, New York City Housing Authority, tells us based on their analysis that is needed to keep the buildings operational, make repairs, etc. Things like elevators, roofs, general apartment repairs. So, that's an enormous amount of money, and it is very difficult for us to obtain that because we don't get that kind of support from the federal government or the city or the state government. So NYCHA is facing quite a fiscal crisis in that way. So I think that's the first thing that I want to say. The other, I think, important thing to know about public housing is that because of this, funding and enormous bill, the conditions leave a lot to be desired, right? We have, failing elevators, we have mold issues, we have even lead issues, we had to be put under monitorship for many of these issues. So these repairs are essential and dire and necessary for providing the kind of quality, safe housing that is necessary to house the almost 500,000 New Yorkers who depend and rely on public housing as one of the last most deeply affordable housing available in New York. And then the last thing is that, the residents that live in public housing are, an essential part of keeping public housing, thriving. And for example, here's one example, like right now during COVID, a lot of residents and leadership and resident associations have stepped up to make sure that families that are in need and that are dealing with food insecurity or health and safety and need like PPE equipment, it's the residents on the ground who have been rallying and coming together and joining and partnering with organizations and elected officials to make sure that their neighbors are safe, so that our residents care for our residents and know firsthand what are the issues that are important to us and what we need, and they need to be put front and center in making decisions and participating in shaping the future of our public housing. So, with this backlog, with this need for residents, with these repairs, what we really need is investment from our city and our state in a permanent way that will help us chip away at this, enormous capital bill that, these capital expenses that are, creating unsafe and unlivable conditions in public housing. And then we also need to make sure that at the federal level, that level of support is there as well.
Yeah. Damaris, we know that you're seeing this firsthand, that you still reside in public housing.
Yes.
And we're going to come back to you for your thoughts on how to advance the needed changes. I want to pivot to homeownership. So although New York City is a city of renters, there are over 1 million homeowners in the city. So Matt, what does homeownership look like in New York City? And why should mayoral candidates be thinking about expanding affordable home ownership?
Thanks so much, Burnell. Again, I'm Matt Dunbar. I'm with Habitat for Humanity in New York City. And It was mentioned before, that this New York City is a city of renters, and the homeownership rate is only 31%. Nationally, it's around 64%. But it's even more important to note that there is severe inequity in the affordable homeownership market, with 43% of homeowners being white households and only 27% of homeowners being Black households. And that number is actually below 20% for Hispanic households. And these are numbers, and nationwide it reflects it as well, that we're actually doing worse with the Black and white homeownership gap than we were doing prior to the Fair Housing Act of 1968. And that has major impacts when it comes to families' ability to build wealth, to have stability. We've seen that in the COVID crisis, that homeowners were all reached out to and were able to contact their mortgage servicers to enter into forbearance plans and things of that nature that provided kind of longer term stability that renter households did not see and continue to be questioning their housing security as rental and eviction bans keep getting put in place, but there hasn't been any solutions coming forward. So it's really important for the city to make sure that we are investing deeply in affordable home ownership, providing opportunities for people to become first-time home buyers, and then also to remain in their homes. Because we see in New York City, 40% of homeowners are actually housing cost burdened still. So there is, still a large need for programs that provide housing counseling, legal services, home repair programs to make sure that people can afford to maintain and stay in their homes, but also that we're investing in new affordable home ownership opportunities. As a nonprofit that develops affordable home ownership, we've seen firsthand the deprioritization of creating new home ownership opportunities over the past 12 years, really since the housing crash. The city and state and various programs have deprioritized affordable home ownership, which has led to that dramatic drop, of multiple percentages from, I think, 34% to 31%. And so it's really critically important that the next mayor prioritizes affordable home ownership that is long-term and permanently affordable to help create that alternative market for first-time homebuyers to be able to enter into affordable home ownership that can then be passed on from generation to generation.
Thank you so much, Matt. Tonight we've heard almost in every conversation just sort of the inequities, both in terms of income, but also across these key issues are the startling racial disparities, that our housing is built on a system of racism. Our neighborhoods are segregated with Black and Latinx, people of color, New Yorkers, more often in low-income neighborhoods that often have been neglected by government. Home ownership was too often denied to Black New Yorkers, like you've said, and taken through predatory practices. We know, again, whether it's contractor scams or, again, the mortgage crisis, denying wealth building opportunity and what's been stripped from the communities, and not just in New York, but across the country. The next mayor really needs to confront this history and reverse and repair it. And I'm just happy to really say that this is one of the underpinnings for United for Housing, that for everything that's being done, racial equity is housing policy. And it must be front and center when we talk about solutions. Absolutely. So with that, I want to go back to Stephanie. What would you like to see the next mayor change in the city's housing plan?
Thanks, Bernal. So we need a lot more housing. That's what we need. And deeply affordable housing, affordable to low-income New Yorkers. There's just not enough of it. And we need we need supportive housing, and we need housing with services. We also need housing for homeless families and homeless people and families. And we need rental assistance for people who are living in private housing. So we need a lot more related to housing assistance and more affordable housing for all.
Yeah, I think we found that a lot of times when we talk about affordable housing, it's built in communities that have, been more focused on, sort of low, moderate income census tracts. And I think we also need to expand affordable housing in high amenity or high income neighborhoods, you know, and just, you know, being able to expand and looking at other opportunities. So with that, I just making comment, but also in terms of Giselle, what is your advice on how the mayor can provide greater leadership in addressing the homelessness crisis?
Yeah, I mean, I want to echo a lot of what Stephanie said. We need affordable housing specifically targeted to people who are homeless and are at the lowest incomes in New York City. And we need real investment to back that up and make it work. So there's not one thing that needs to be done. There's a whole host of things that need to be done. And so among those things are, you know, we need rental subsidies that can compete in the market. We need new production of housing that is specifically targeted to extremely low income and homeless households. We need supportive housing, as Stephanie mentioned. And one of the things that we're going to need, we're going to urgently need moving forward is prevention assistance for the families who are at imminent risk of eviction due to income loss as a result of COVID. You know, it's one thing to help delay a potential eviction, but at the end of the day, a lot of these families are going to need assistance paying rent, paying off rental arrears, with financial assistance to pay their rent going forward. And so that prevention investment is really going to be key as well in the coming year. So it's just important overall for the city to be linking its housing goals with homelessness. You know, a lot of what we've seen and challenges that we've seen in the city are that, you know, the homeless provision and the housing production are siloed within City Hall. And we really need a structure that makes sure when the city is creating a housing plan that they are doing so with full acknowledgement of how the extent of the homelessness crisis and how that plan can help address homelessness. Thank you again for that.
Damaris, I think this is your chance to really provide advice for preserving NYCHA housing and providing residents with better services and housing standards. So what's your advice?
Advice. Well, first, you know, let me just say that I want to acknowledge the Housing Conference for making sure that public housing is on the agenda as part of an overall housing plan, because one of the things that has happened for far too long is that public housing was not given the same level of priority as our other housing. So, and I think that's part of the reason why we're in this, you know, some of the mess that we're in, and that, you know, we have $40 billion in repairs. So, you know, my advice would be, one, to make sure that our public housing residents and the needs to preserve this vital, affordable housing that, you know, in times like during COVID, was able to adjust rents for residents even when they lost their jobs, so that they're not going to be facing the same threat of eviction as other renters will be. So keeping, you know, the public housing up front and center, making sure that it is part of, you know, any housing plan that moves forward, because again, it is a, you know, does provide 8% of the rental units in the city, and that's an enormous amount of housing, an enormous amount of people. So, you know, that's the first thing I would say. Making sure that our voices are heard, residents are participating, that there's ample opportunity for that, that we are prioritized, because it is essential. I would also say that the Housing Authority needs to also provide better management and operations. And again, I don't want to keep going back to residents, but I can't help it, because residents are indeed a core and vital part of the public housing communities. They keep our communities running. You know, they know what we need. They are the best experts at working with the Housing Authority and other partners to say, these are the kind of repairs, these are the types of adjustments, these are the things that should be prioritized. So they have to be put in a position where they are not left out of any of the decisions that are happening. So those are some, quick and dirty things, I think, making sure we're a part of the plan, making sure resident voices are heard, making sure, that we are working to be prioritized like every other vital housing in this city.
And we need to force the new mayor to champion this effort. So absolutely.
It has to be something that we push as part of that platform and require and request and demand, or whatever it is that you feel most comfortable with, advocate, organize for, that the next mayor of New York makes a commitment to dedicate important resources to public housing.
Thank you so much. And Matt, we go from public housing to private housing, home ownership opportunities. So Matt, what are some of the things that we can do to improve home ownership opportunities in New York City?
Yeah, I think that there are three main buckets. There's essentially, creating more opportunities, accessing opportunities that exist, and then preserving homeownership that also exists. And on the creating opportunities, I think it's really critically important that the city continue to align its strategies with investment that remains affordable in perpetuity. So I think it's really important that the city increase its investment in affordable homeownership through programs like the Open Door program, and creating new multifamily homeownership opportunities that are limited equity and permanently affordable, especially in partnership with community land trusts and other limited equity models. Really investigates and looks at ways that the city can help to finance opportunities for tenants to purchase their buildings, so that renters can have the opportunity to own a piece of New York City in the communities where they already live, and to make sure that the financing is available and the capital is available for that to be done and to remain permanently affordable for the next generation of home buyers. So I think that those are some critical strategies on the supply side. On the access side, we've seen and studies have shown from CHAIA and the Center for New York City Neighborhoods that so many of the homes, the very limited homes that are available and affordable to people of low income and working class households, those have really been bought up by a lot of investors, and we've seen 38% of that housing stock that's accessible and affordable for low and working class homeowners or future homeowners have been bought by investors and turned into rentals. And so it's critically important that we seek to preserve existing homeownership opportunities and providing increased access to down payment assistance, streamline that down payment assistance so that real people can access and compete in the markets that exist to be able to access those homes. I think those are really critical aspects. And then preservation, I think it's really important that we continue to invest in home repair programs, foreclosure prevention programs, and of course, community land trusts in order to see that folks have the resources available to them to be able to stay in their homes, and that programs that the city have, like the New York City tax lien sale that essentially sells low-income homeowners' tax debts to investors and then actually helps to destabilize low-income communities of color, are actually completely reformed and aligned more with the city's affordable housing strategies to really help provide support to either keep those families in their homes or make sure that those homes can opt into affordable home ownership as part of their workout plans and long-term strategies.
Thank you, Matt.
So we have a few questions from the chat if you want to take those right now, Burnell.
That'll be great.
Okay. So an easy one coming in, and this would be, I think, for Matt. Can you define community land trusts? But we have questions also for Giselle and Damaris.
Sure thing. A community land trust is essentially a not-for-profit organization that tends to be made up of local residents of the housing on community land trusts, nonprofit organizations and supporters, and community members. And the not-for-profit community land trust exists to essentially own land in perpetuity. And in the circumstances of housing, That land is owned by the non-for-profit community-based organization, and then the improvements are owned or managed by either the residents or an external property owner, whether it be a rental building owned by a rental owner, or a cooperative owned by the residents, or a single-family home owned by the homeowner. And that CLT essentially has a ground lease relationship with the building owners or homeowners that require that property remain affordable for income restricted residents or home buyers in perpetuity, to ensure stewardship and long-term support for that housing, to ensure that it remains a part of the city's permanent affordable housing stock.
Thanks, Matt. Kind of a similar note, there's a couple of questions here about a resident management cooperative program for NYCHA residents. I'm wondering, Damaris, if you have any opinion on that, and maybe you could just tell viewers also what that entails.
So, I've been asked this question many times, and honestly, my opinion and personal belief is that public housing should remain public housing, and it should not become cooperative unless there is a perpetual pipeline of affordable housing development. If we convert to cooperative housing, we lose those units of affordable housing for other needy, low-income residents of our city. So that's, the position that we have undertaken at Goals. That is the position that, in my opinion, and I live in public housing, I would personally benefit, if we were to convert to cooperative housing. And while I understand that, we do want to incorporate wealth building strategies through home ownership, we can't do so at the risk of losing the last deeply affordable housing that we have in this city.
So speaking of deeply affordable, there's a question here on the affordable housing income guidelines. I'm going to direct that one to Stephanie. And the question is really, before deductions, that the income before deductions, I think basically doesn't leave you with enough at the end of the month, right? The chat is saying that some families' medical coverage could be $400 a month, and this money is considered when their rent is determined. So, Stephanie, a question to you: do you think that our rent, our affordability standards that you pay 30% of your income, pre-tax is fair? And I think especially at the lower your income, the harder it is to make it in New York City. So I'm wondering what you think about that.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that we think about a lot. And, there's been a lot of talk of lowering that to 20 or 25%. That's what it was in the past. 30%, it's one thing if you are making $100,000 a year, but if you're making $30,000 a year, that doesn't leave you a lot extra after you pay your rent to pay for medical expenses and for food and for clothing and other things. And now with the pandemic, computers and other things like that. So yeah, it's not, I think it's a good point. We should be focusing on lowering it to 20 or 25%, particularly for very low income New Yorkers.
We had a question early on in the chat asking about the homeless folks living in homeless shelters and about disabilities. And the question was specifically around how many people in shelters have intellectual or developmental disabilities. But I'm going to broaden that for you, Giselle, maybe to talk about it more generally. What sort of disabilities are folks in shelter facing, and are we doing enough to get services?
Yeah, it's a great question, and one I think highlights an issue that is a problem that's been present in the shelter system for a long time, and one that we've been aiming to address over the past few years. So the Coalition for the Homeless and the Center for the Independence of the Disabled are actually plaintiffs in a lawsuit that the Legal Aid Society brought against the city, arguing that the shelter system was not meeting guidelines under the Americans with Disabilities Act, and the shelter system was not accessible for people with disabilities. So we actually have a settlement in that lawsuit now, and there's a time frame by which the city has to take certain steps, not only to address physical accessibility, but also accessibility within the process of applying for shelter and going through kind of those bureaucratic barriers. So we don't know exactly how many people who are homeless are living with intellectual or developmental disabilities, but the way that the city has started to assess that at the moment is a little bit more broad. And so what the sort of the latest data that we have on that are that about 60% of homeless households are living with some type of disability. So that's either a single adult that has a disability or a member of a family that is living with a disability. And so that's pretty extraordinarily high number. And that includes, you know, a whole range of different types of disabilities, but it shows how, you know, how significant it is, how difficult it may be to navigate the shelter system, what types of housing we might eventually need to be building and targeting for folks who are homeless. But it's a great question.
There's another question specifically on what is the Open Door program?
Sure. The Open Door program is the program that the New York City Housing Agency provides for subsidies to build affordable homeownership opportunities. And so there are many programs like the low-income housing tax credit and various supporting housing programs and other types of rental subsidies for rental housing. In New York City, Open Door is really the primary subsidy program that provides those of us that develop affordable homeownership capital subsidies that help that housing get built or rehabilitated and then sold for low to moderate income home ownership. So that is really the central program and the central strategy for the city to build and rehabilitate home ownership.
Great. So Bernell, did you have other questions? There's one more in the chat that is asking, what do you think about the PACT Section 8 program? So this is really NYCHA strategies for preservation and public-private partnerships. I mean, maybe I would build on that and ask also, are there ways that it could be improved?
Are you asking me or the panel?
You could ask the panel. Why don't you start, Damaris, if you don't mind?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I was on mute, so.
I think,
Damaris, please do.
Thank you. So PACT is also known as RAD, and it is a tool, it is a strategy, like Rachel said, that will create public-private partnerships between the housing authority. They would lease the land, the housing to a private developer who then manages the property and essentially gets funding through Section 8 in order to make a profit, right? And also to position them so that they can leverage other financial tools, like other incentives and loans and things that a traditional private landlord can have access to when they need to make repairs that public housing doesn't have access to. So in theory, it makes a lot of sense. It's still, new in terms of its implementation. There's only about, I think there's less than 2,000 units in New York right now that have all been successfully converted. And there's been a lot of issues and there's been a lot of learning opportunities because people have, early on in the process, there weren't a lot of rules in place and there were evictions and other things. But it's one of those programs that NYCHA had to be creative and think about what actually comes from the federal level, but they have to be creative and think about how to generate resources. And so my personal opinion about it is, though, that I'm not in favor of any program that privatizes public housing, even in a slow way, even in a partial way. It's a tricky situation, you know. I think residents are fearful of it at the same time, and it leads to a lot of confusion. On the other hand, you know, at some point we've got to understand that we're not getting resources from any other way. And so, you know, we've got to be creative too and think about tools that will help us generate the kind of revenue that is necessary to run the housing authority. So in most cases, what we tend to do is to defer to the residents of any particular development where this is happening and let them lead the conversation around what they want for their developments, but making sure that the process is transparent, that they have the information that they need so that they're making well-informed decisions. But privatization, which is what it feels like to us, is not something that we're in favor of. And it is part of a larger strategy right now that's being used, but I don't want to take up any more time and talk about that, but I hope we might get a chance to say something about the blueprint for change at some point.
Yes. Damaris, I think, you know, you're really, in terms of all the things that you've said in regards to the housing, I think that, you know, the meetings that we've had, because United for Housing and the New York Housing Conference, several others have had conversation with the chairman of NYCHA and sort of the plan, and it still takes federal investment, you know, for any of this to work. And so, you know, understanding there's been long ways that the city has been trying to come up with solutions. And it does include sort of the privatization of spaces, you know, taking parking lots and other vacant land that's within NYCHA and building, you know, housing and using a different program. So understanding, you know, that it does need to be understood. It needs to be a transparent process, but absent the federal government being able to step up to the plate and provide the billions of dollars that are needed, you know, we have to look at alternative plans, and it is up to the residents too to hold the new mayor as well as others accountable. So thank you again for your comments on that. Rachel, how much time do we have for any more, or will others be joining back?
I think that we are wrapping up now. I just want to confirm with Lydia. Are we concluding the panel now, Lydia?
Yes, yes.
Okay. So Burnell, if you want to have a final word.
Okay, so just overall for our audience, what are the housing issues that you want to highlight in New York City's next housing plan? Do you have a housing story that you want to share that can inform policy? What advice do you have for New York City's next mayor? We hope that you were able to participate in the breakout room. And if not, you can share your ideas on the United for Housing website or identify yourself in the chat, and United for Housing will follow up with you after the event. As I said before, vote, fill out the census, and participate, be civically engaged, and speak up for what you think, not just on housing, but all of the issues around the city. We need to hold our elected officials accountable. So I very much want to thank our panel. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Damaris. Thank you, Giselle. Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you to everyone watching. Thank you to Rachel. Thank you to everyone. Please fill out the survey and help us tell the next mayor how to improve housing in New York City. So I'm going to turn things over to the powers that be here.
Yeah, we're going to go back to Lydia, who is going to sum up some of the discussions in the breakout rooms before we conclude.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Rachel, and thank you everyone for joining us on this really great panel tonight. One thing that I want to do before we talk about the breakout sessions is to I'll share my screen. This is the Mentimeter that we filled out earlier this evening in one word. What does housing mean to you? And I'm seeing a lot of great responses here to us on this call this evening. Housing means stability. Just think a little bit about what that means to you. You know, the largest and most popular response we got this evening is that housing is stability. Housing is also affordable. It's safety, family, peace, comfort, and home. a safe haven. So this is sort of one version of the summary from the remarks that people have started to submit for input this evening. Again, we can continue to collect your feedback on the survey and also through the Google Doc. If you'd like to continue editing and refining your remarks, you are of course welcome to do so. A few quick reflections from the breakout rooms that I was in as we were sort of going through the discussions. First, I want to thank everyone for being, so candid. These are critical issues that we'd like to really emphasize for the next mayor. So I was really, happy to see a lot of people sharing their experiences and things that they'd like the next mayor to see, hear, and know about what they can do about housing in New York City. So I heard, just a couple of stories that you all can also sort of see and explore in the Google Doc. That when we are thinking about housing for deeply affordable housing for people who are homeless or need supportive services, that the next mayor should know that it's not enough to just provide the space. It's not enough to just provide the housing and the real estate for those people to sort of exist. In order for them to have healthy lives, it's also critical to provide the supportive services that sort of match their need. So we're able to sort of provide them not just the space, but also the things that they need to exist in that space in a safe sort of way. We talked in some of my groups a lot about that issue and the potential of under COVID-19, and really a lot of questions about the hotel and the future of the hotel industry, that there's a lot of opportunity there to think about transitioning some of those units into permanent affordable housing, that the city and the next mayor should think really carefully and long and hard about the opportunity to take advantage of those types of real estate. We talked a lot about how when there are organizations providing sort of different types of services, that things like, especially under COVID-19, sanitation are right now the condition of the spaces where we're meant to exist. It's not sanitary, and that's leading to a lot of the disparate outcomes that we're seeing today of higher levels of death and sickness. Because we are not providing that level of quality housing and safe housing to our residents. So lots of stories that we sort of collected about the potential to think about new ways to address those specific needs. On another topic, we also talked about the real need to help the city think creatively about supporting not just new construction, but thinking about the existing housing stock and how that can be improved for our residents. So thinking, even though on the new construction side, that's where a lot of the revenue is, there's an opportunity to think about how can we improve housing for our existing residents by focusing explicitly on those existing units, especially with a potential eviction crisis looming before us. So those are a couple of my reflections. And if anyone else would like to say a couple words about their breakout room, you can raise a hand or say in the chat. Looks like someone says that I was freezing, but those are a couple of reflections from the breakout rooms that we had this evening. Any reactions from our panelists about some of the statements that you've heard tonight? No? Okay. I can turn it back over to Rachel to close us out this evening.
Okay, great. Well, thank you everybody for being here. I'm just gonna share my screen again. So 1 second. Bear with me. having a little bit of trouble doing it, but I guess I could just, let's see. Sorry for that delay. So you can see my screen now?
Yes.
Okay. So I just want to thank everybody for being here tonight. We think good policy is made from the ground up, so we really want you to stay involved. We think this is really just one, way to give some input today in these breakout discussions, but we have other ways that you can provide input into these recommendations we're shaping for New York City's next mayor on housing investment. So the first thing is you can go to our website. It's linked at the bottom of that page. It's at the New York Housing Conference website. There's a link to U for Housing. We have the hashtag U for Housing. And you can go there and you can complete a survey, and you're going to be asked for your ideas, for your advice. If you have ideas about siting, you have ideas about policy changes, you want to make your priorities known on housing for the next mayor, we would love that input to shape our report. And hearing from you, I think, makes it all the more real, tying these policy issues to New Yorkers and their real thoughts and experiences and needs around housing. So that's the first thing. Go to our website, complete the survey. The second is we would love to share your housing story. I feel like every New Yorker has a very compelling housing story, but if you're willing to share yours with this campaign, we want to share it in social media. We want to share it with the candidates. Even having some examples when we meet with the candidates face to face of saying, why do we need this investment in NYCHA so urgently? That story about a repair that's needed in your apartment is very helpful to communicate, making this real. Or if it's, you've been impacted by COVID and someone in your household has lost work and you're one of those families that are really holding on at the edge right now, and we have an eviction moratorium in place, but one day it's going to be lifted, and you might be at risk, and share that story with us. And we want to communicate that to these candidates running for mayor to make sure that housing is a top priority in their investment strategy moving forward and part of New York City's recovery. So the second way, share your story. It's really important. And the third is support us on social media. Once we launch our report later this year, we will be interacting with the mayoral hopefuls. We'll be interacting with the press. We want to really be out in front and make sure that housing stays a key issue in the New York City mayoral campaign. So help us do that. Follow us at U for Housing and use the hashtag U for Housing to share your housing stories. So again, thank you to our panel tonight. I know Damaris said she wants to talk about the blueprint and we didn't have time, so I'm going to catch you offline to talk about the blueprint. And to everyone else, I really appreciate your time, your dedication, helping moving housing forward in New York City. And thank you to everybody that participated. So one last special shout out to Wes Moore from Robin Hood and to Public Advocate Jumaane Williams for their words, which were truly inspiring. So thank you, everybody. Good night.
Thank you. Thank you for organizing the call.
Thank you for your leadership,
Yes.
Rachel.
Yes.
Thank you so
Good
much.
night.
Have a good evening, everyone.
Good night.